feel free to share your screen and take it away. Thank you so much.
All right, screen should be shared, and I turned my mic back on, right? Perfect. Got the thumbs up. Excellent. Well, yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me here today. Let's move from pyrosomes to something a little bit bigger. Um, so diving in, I know a lot of this is background for folks, but just in case, we all know the open ocean is huge. It's critically important to life on our planet. But it's of course quite challenging to access, and really critically for my interest is that it can be hard to understand from our terrestrial human perspective. So one way that we can work on having different, viewpoints of the ocean and different perspectives is to think about what do the predators know and what do the predators see. So in this, really huge open ocean that we perceive as largely featureless, top marine predators are connecting the ocean horizontally, as you can see here in some shark tagging data, and also vertically with all kinds of top predators who are diving from the sunlit surface down into the deep ocean. There's a particular focus, as you can infer from this nice illustration here, on predators diving into the mesopelagic, but excursions to the bathypelagic are also observed across multiple taxa. And as these predators are moving through the open ocean ecosystems, was it going to advance here? There we go. They mediate ecosystem processes. They're acting as sentinels of their ecosystems, really integrating over the health and status of the food web to potentially reveal insights into unobserved or underobserved ecosystem components. And of course, they are highly valuable. So for a kind of quick estimate, we could look to the overall monetary value of marine fisheries, of which tuna and billfish are some 10%. But also we could think about the benefits that these fisheries can provide to communities, including small island developing states. So for example, some recent work that we did in the Pacific developed a monitoring framework for benefits of the local tuna industry to self-determined objectives such as reducing poverty and inequality, addressing gender inequalities, and improving health and food security. And of course, beyond fisheries, marine predators provide cultural services like tourism and recreation, inspire the designs of engineers, have to include that one now that I'm based in Bari, and much more. All of which really brings to the primary question that drives my research, which is how are these predators connecting pelagic ecosystems? And more specifically, we could think about, what role do trophic connections play in those connections? How is movement ecology necessary as the mechanism? When we humans start to get involved with our pesky interactions with the ocean, we might start to alter animal behavior. And then looking to the future, what kind of technological advances are really needed to study and to observe and to understand these predators? But today, in the interest of time, I'll focus on that first one, looking at what role do trophic connections play, where an area of critical interest to this question really is down in the mesopelagic. So I don't think I need to tell anyone on this call that there's a lot of stuff down there, a lot of biomass, which is increasingly of interest for commercial harvest, and that these changes to mesopelagic animal ecology and abundance, whether it's associated with fisheries, deep sea mining, climate change, so on, will impact the many top predators that feed on mesopelagic prey. So today I'm going to focus on three of those predators, starting with the swordfish. So for those who aren't familiar, swordfish typically mirror the diel vertical migration of that mesopelagic community. We have big-eyed tuna, who are also typically shallow at night and deep during the day, but instead of one, long, smooth descent and then ascending at the end of the day, they're actually doing a series of very short dives from the surface to the mesopelagic all day long. So an energy-intensive behavior, we can only assume. And then for a bit of a contrast, the third predator I'll talk about is the yellowfin tuna, which tends to be up in shallow surface waters pretty much all of the time, but occasionally does deep dives to the mesopelagic, usually hitting kind of the upper layers of the mesopelagic. And what we really wanted to do with this work was then to quantify the reliance of these three predators, who are of course all quite economically valuable, on the mesopelagic for their food, so that we can look ahead to proper and effective ecosystem-based fisheries management of both the predator and the prey stocks. So to that goal specifically, we quantified the diet sourcing for our three predators in a North Atlantic context. Forgive me, I know this is the Pacific call. The trends are probably similar. So the method we used for this was compound-specific stable isotope analysis of carbon. So Liz already chatted a bit about doing bulk isotope work with carbon and nitrogen, and this is compound-specific, meaning in this context that we're looking at essential amino acids. For anyone not familiar, essential amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, are synthesized only at the base of the food web by basal food web members like plants, bacteria, fungi, so on. And each of these basal groups has unique biochemical pathways to make amino acids, which result in them each having their own carbon isotope pattern, or what we usually call a fingerprint. And because these essential amino acids are made only at the base of the food web, their carbon isotope ratios are unchanged as they move through consumers, which means we can take a sample from a consumer and look at its carbon isotopes in those amino acids to estimate where did its carbon in its food ultimately come from. And this is typically over a time integrated period corresponding to several months, just depending on exactly what kind of animal and what part of its body. So a quick guide through the sample collection that we had for this, beginning with our predator collections of the three species, the 2 tuna and the swordfish, through collaboration with a commercial longline fishing vessel off the east coast of the US. These came from not only the fishing vessel, but also the excellent and rather large fish freezer of Walt Gullet up at the University of Maine. And then once we had these predator samples, we really needed to put them into a larger context of their prey and of the different food webs that they're going to be feeding in and moving through. So specifically to do this, we developed a series of what we called food web reference groups to represent distinct food webs in which these predators, as I said, are feeding or which we assume they're feeding in. So up first, we had a local epipelagic food web reference group using small, low trophic level epipelagic fishes like flying fish, which we're particularly keen to be involved as our first collections of these guys is because they flew right into the boat. We then used an existing collection of small mesopelagic fishes like myctophids and hatchetfish as a local mesopelagic food web reference group. Once we'd collected and processed all these samples, this is what it starts to look like. So I'll show you a series of plots here, and in each plot, each point is an individual animal. Points that are closer together have a more similar carbon source. If they're further apart, a more different carbon source, and the lines simply connect samples of the same group to their average group value. So first here we have our epipelagic and mesopelagic food web reference groups, and we see right away that these two food webs have different carbon signatures, which is great. This was very exciting. Now we can start to add in our predators. So first here, the big-eyed tuna in green. And you can see that these samples are almost right in the middle of our mesopelagic and epipelagic reference groups, suggesting that they get their carbon from a mixture of the two zones, which makes perfect sense. Next, we bring in the swordfish and our yellowfin tuna. And whereas we saw that the big-eyed tuna was fairly centered between the epipelagic and mesopelagics, those swordfish and yellowfin kind of extend well above the carbon space bounded by those two reference groups. This actually was a question that we had for quite a long time on this project, which is what is the carbon signature or what's the food web that we're missing? Or put more simply, what goes where that giant question mark is? Based on the seasonal movements of the predators, our hypothesis was always that this missing signature was tropical, which, long story short, we were correct on that one. Happy to talk more about the details later, but essentially we creatively accumulated some tropical fishes from people's garages. Here are those seasonal movements for anyone who's not familiar. So summers are temperate, winters are tropical, nice life. And here are some of the places that we got those tropical samples. So in the Virgin Islands, working with a sports fishing charter, and then off the coast of Miami, working again with the sports fisher to get these swordfish, have the swordfish collect the samples for us, using their stomachs as a great collecting opportunity for mesopelagic fishes. Bringing this all together then, we can see now that our predator carbon is likely a mix of sources from our three reference groups due to their seasonal migration. And now that we were able to bound the carbon source of the predators, we could actually continue on and quantify these carbon source inputs using Bayesian mixing models. So rather than with the principal components, it's just a bit, yes, they're in the middle, great. Now we can actually get some numbers. There we go. So here are the results of those Bayesian mixing models, where each bar is an individual animal, and they're colored by the percent contribution of each of our three carbon sources, the temperate epipelagic, temperate mesopelagic, and a mixed tropical group, to each of our individual predators. And I've arranged the predators by increasing mesopelagic carbon contribution within each species, which you'll notice is that dark blue color that right away it probably pops out that was the highest and most consistent, that mesopelagic sourcing for the big eye, but with large mesopelagic carbon contributions across all three species. You may be wondering, as I did when I first looked at these model results, why the mesopelagic carbon sourcing is a bit lower in a lot of those swordfish and yellowfin samples. And after looking at that for a while, we remembered that not all of our samples were collected at the same time of year. So those white dots on the figure there are the day of year of collection. So if it was at the bottom, be January 1st, at the top would be December 31st. And we can really see that jump in mesopelagic carbon contribution to swordfish and yellowfin in our fall samples collected in November versus those that were collected in the summer. The reason for this being that, as I mentioned earlier, the stable isotopes in what we used were liver samples are averaging over about 5 months. So in the 5 months leading up to November, the fishes have all been in our local temperate waters and are really going to be reflecting carbon sourcing from those food webs. So then, to get a more representative view of temperate mesopelagic carbon sourcing, here are the predators' average percent mesopelagic carbon sourcing from fall samples only. So we see across all three of our predator species, they're sourcing about 50 to 60% of their diet from those mesopelagic food webs. Putting this together with a quick summary of their movement data, that means then that we see all three predators who have very different vertical movement strategies, spending half their time in the mesopelagic, some of their time, very little of their time, are all sourcing about 50 to 60% of their diet from these mesopelagic food webs, which of course is going to have important management implications for any potential mesopelagic fishing opportunities or harvests on these predator stocks, including the highly valuable existing fisheries that are well established for tunas and swordfish. And rather than just saying this, I'll actually walk you through some recent work we did to really bring these ecology and diet sourcing results into a fisheries and resource economics context. So to describe the potential impacts of these mesopelagic fisheries on predator stocks, we began with an existing model from Melina Carentidu and Di Jin, which looked at the economic viability of mesopelagic fisheries. So I will leave almost all the math out for today, though it's all published, or certainly come chat with me about it after. But the basic setup is here in equations, or I will put it into words. We have a predator stock and a prey stock, and the size of the predator population, its biomass, is a combination of overall growth, which includes a predator-prey dynamic, minus how much the fishery for each population takes out. And same idea for the prey, its own growth and its own harvest. We've got two independent fisheries here, one for each stock. But two really important questions in this kind of work are, firstly, how reliant is the predator on the prey? And secondly, how do we actually describe that reliance mathematically? And it's not as simple as it may sound. So to parameterize that relationship between predator and prey, we of course went back to the previous project's results, where the big-eyed tuna sourced about 60% of their carbon from mesopelagic food webs. We couldn't plug this percent diet sourcing into the initial trophic parameter in the original model because this initial trophic parameter was one that's commonly used in these sorts of predator-prey models where it's a rather nebulous interaction term that tells you interaction is stronger or weaker, but there's not a direct biological meaning. So what we did in this work was to define a new model term, D, creative, the diet share, which we related to the tuna's overall biomass and carrying capacity. So for example, if the tuna gets 60% of its diet from the mesopelagic, then 60% of its biomass relies on that mesopelagic food source as it changes in its own biomass over time, and the other 40% of the tuna biomass is independent. So it doesn't care what happens to the mesopelagic, meaning if the mesopelagic stock, for example, went to 0, the tuna would be at 40% of its hypothetical carrying capacity. So, building up the model here, we adapted sort of classical predator-prey models, as well as this existing mesopelagic specific model in the context of two Atlantic stocks. We have our big-eyed tuna, and then we had a mixed mesopelagic fish stock. Each of these had their own fishery. In the model then, the maximum harvest of each of these modeled fisheries is set by a single hypothetical manager. So for example, this could be a high seas fisheries management organization. The manager then optimizes over the harvests of both stocks to maximize the total overall profit. And this model setup allows us to ask questions like, what difference does a predator-prey interaction make? And what are the impacts of changing prices and costs? For the sake of time, I'm going to focus just on the latter today, but briefly, as you would expect, the strength of the predator-prey interaction does make a big difference to the profitability and the general impacts on the model tuna fishery. What we were particularly interested in with this work was the sensitivity of model results to changes in prices and costs, because of course the exact values for mesopelagic fisheries of prices and costs are not yet known. And this is what we get when we look at the resulting profits of each fishery. Again, we have a mesopelagic fishery and a tuna fishery as prices and costs vary. So starting here with the mesopelagic fisheries profit, which are the colored bars, each color is going to represent a different scenario. So for example, in red down at the bottom here, we have what if, I think you can see my cursor, what if tuna prices are really low? What if they're kind of medium? What if tuna prices are really high? And you can see that there's basically no impact on the mesopelagic fishery as those price and cost conditions change for the tuna fishery. So tuna sells for more, tuna sells for less, doesn't matter in the context of what the mesopelagic fishery is doing. However, the mesopelagic fishery profit is strongly influenced by changes to the price of mesopelagic fishes, which is not very surprising, and it's moderately impacted by changes to the cost of fishing the mesopelagic. So for example, is fuel cost changing? In sharp contrast, though, here are the profits of the modeled tuna fishery under different economic conditions. So we can see immediately that the profitability of the modeled tuna fishery is very sensitive to changes in price and cost. And at the average anticipated prices and costs, which would be the middle bar for each color, for example, this one here, it's the profitability of that tuna fishery is really right on the borderline, and in many scenarios, the tuna fishery is projected to be losing money. So then, with this relatively simple model, we were able to investigate the implications of potential mesopelagic forage fisheries for big eye tuna stocks and demonstrate that profitable fisheries on both predator and prey are certainly possible, but are highly uncertain. And we note that the social planner problem, model type presented here, where we have a single manager optimizing over both stocks, is not meant to be a perfect representation of reality, but rather to provide important benchmarks for evaluating real-world cases and to provide useful information for identifying trade-offs in ecosystems-based fisheries management. We really feel that this work is relevant and timely to the management of both the predator and the prey stocks, including international governance of tuna through their RFMOs, and of the high seas more broadly. And I'll note that in this fisheries model for this project, we focused on the big eye tuna, but the results are likely to be similar for fisheries on other tunas and swordfish. Furthermore, a decline in any mesopelagic forage availability has ecological implications for predators beyond big fishes, such as marine mammals and seabirds of cultural value and of conservation concern. So, by quantifying the contributions of the mesopelagic food web to these three predators and predicting the impacts of mesopelagic fisheries on tuna stocks, we hope that this work can assist policy development for emerging mesopelagic fisheries and mitigation of ecosystem impacts. So we really welcome any suggestions or opportunities to continue onwards with this work. Thanks for your attention. Happy to take any questions.
Thanks for a great talk. Just as in last time, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions.
Some of
Thanks, Colleen,
the
for the chat.
first slides, sorry, yeah. And some of the first slides you showed the kind of migration of tuna, and there were so many like dives between also and within the day, kind of over the day, and quite, as you said, quite energy intensive. But why would tuna spend that energy migrating if they could just follow the prey, I guess,
Yeah, well,
by staying down?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, the reason that we think that they don't just stay down all day like the swordfish do is that it's there's a couple of physical variables that could be at play here, but it's probably because it's simply too cold for them to be down for that long. Like oxygen, for example, could also be important, but we think it's really driven by temperature. And then the reason for doing those repeated dives then being that food resource down there must either be such higher quality or that it's more highly aggregated. So better bang for buck of foraging activity than resources available in the epipelagic. But yeah, as you can see in that dive pattern, they're doing this all day
so
long.
much.
They're really keen on that food.
Yeah, man. Yeah. So they like to be warm, but also have snacks. I get it.
Yeah, I mean, don't we all? Don't we all like to be warm and also have snacks?
I had a quick question about the migratory behavior of I think it was the swordfish and the yellowfin, maybe, where you had that seasonal trace of mesopelagic prey. Just wondering, can you clarify, are they actually moving out to mesopelagic habitats further offshore during that time, or is it that the abundance of mesopelagic prey has changed?
So with those seasonal shifts, so gut contents from other studies would suggest that just the gut contents are always having mesopelagic fishes and epipelagic prey resources in them throughout the year. So that would very much suggest that they are consuming both when they're temperate, consuming both when they're tropical. We weren't able to resolve the difference in the carbon isotope signatures between tropical epipelagic and tropical mesopelagic, probably because of differences in larger carbon flux. But in terms of the seasonal shifts in the swordfish and the yellowfin tuna, so that would be why the samples that we collected in the summertime had that big carbon contribution of tropical carbon, because it's holding over from when they were in the tropics up until, say May or June. And if we're collecting them in like July and August, they haven't turned over enough of their tissue yet to represent large temperate prey resource carbon sourcing. Does that answer your question?
It does, yes. Thank you for the clarification and great presentation.
Thanks.
Well, I have one more question. Just wondering, when you think about the policy implications for some of this work, um, currently it's my understanding that there's not any existing framework for managing mesopelagic fisheries at the RFMO level. But just wondering, what would be your recommendations if there is interest in establishing kind of and expanding mesopelagic fisheries? What would you say to some of those managers trying to decide whether or not it's worth it?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's a couple of lines you could take there, right? I mean, it's firstly, from a sort of simple economic perspective, how worth it is it going to be to you to harvest these mesopelagic fishes, which tend to be expensive to collect and not worth very much when you sell them. So that's the most simple single species sort of approach, right? But then beyond that, I think really looking at these broader ecosystem impacts and trying to have valuation of the different ecosystem services that'll be impacted by large-scale mesopelagic harvest. So I mean, I talked about impacts on tuna and swordfish fisheries, which are worth a fair bit of economic value in terms of money, but also are like jobs. There's cultural value to them. There's a lot of benefits beyond simply the money they're producing, and impacts on things like carbon sequestration through the Twilight Zone. So I think it's always very tempting, right, when it's so overwhelming to have these fisheries discussions to focus just in on one thing, but there's a lot of complicated stuff going on there. So that's what we were hoping to do with this work, is really to provide some benchmarks and some published, I hesitate to say arguments, but some published lines of evidence about what the impacts might be.